There is a moment, you won't see it coming. Nobody rings a bell, there's no countdown. It's the moment an empath, someone who has spent years absorbing the emotional weight of everyone around them, simply stops. Not out of cruelty, not out of hate, out of depletion. And here is what nobody tells you about that moment. Asterisk, everything changes. Not because you became someone else. Because you stopped subsidizing everyone else's comfort with your own exhaustion. Let's be precise about what's happening, because precision is power. For years, you have operated as a regulator. You absorbed tension in rooms before anyone noticed it existed. You anticipated needs before they were spoken. You apologized for things that weren't your fault just to keep the peace intact. This wasn't kindness in its purest form. It was a system other people built their behavior around without ever acknowledging it. And systems, once disrupted, reveal exactly what they were made of. When you stop reaching out first, silence. When you stop over-explaining yourself, confusion, even anger. When you stop absorbing other people's moods as emergencies, you'll watch, in real time, who is attracted to your presence, and who is attracted to your function. This is not bitterness, this is asterisk data. Here is the principle. Asterisk attention is currency, and currency only has value when it's not unlimited. The moment you stop deploying yours indiscriminately, the market, the relationship, the friendship, the family dynamic, repriced itself instantly. People who only valued the version of you that gave endlessly will feel the absence like a tremor, and those who valued you, not your output, will adjust, lean in, show up differently. This is the filter. This is the test you never had to design. Life designed it for you the second you stop performing exhaustion as love. Understand something important. Detachment is not the death of empathy. It is empathy finally extended toward yourself. You can still notice. You can still understand. You can still care about the outcome, without sacrificing your nervous system on the altar of someone else's comfort. This is not about becoming cold, it's about becoming asterisk accurate. Accurate about who reciprocates. Accurate about what relationships were built on mutual respect versus convenient one-sided extraction. Accurate about your own worth, independent of how much you're willing to bleed for it. So if you are standing at that edge right now, exhausted, hypervigilant, carrying weight that was never yours to carry, know this: the moment you stop, you are not abandoning anyone. You are simply revealing the truth that was always there. And the truth, once revealed, changes everything. The idea that chronic caring is automatically a virtue deserves a much closer look, because what looks like compassion on the surface is often something far more mechanical underneath. When someone consistently monitors the emotional temperature of every room they enter, consistently absorbs tension before it's even spoken aloud, and consistently prioritizes other people's comfort above their own, this is not necessarily a conscious moral choice happening in real time. More often, it is a learned pattern, wired into the nervous system long before the person had the language to understand what was happening to them. This pattern frequently traces back to early environments where emotional safety was conditional. A child who grew up in a household with unpredictable moods, criticism, or instability often learns, without ever being taught explicitly, that survival depends on reading people accurately and quickly. If a caregiver's anger could be predicted and softened by being agreeable, helpful, or invisible, the nervous system encodes that strategy as effective. Years later, that same strategy resurfaces, not as a conscious decision to be kind, but as an automatic, almost reflexive scanning of other people's emotional states. This is hypervigilance, and it is fundamentally a stress response, not a virtue. The confusion arises because hypervigilance and genuine compassion can look identical from the outside. Both involve noticing other people's needs. Both involve responding to distress. Both involve a willingness to put someone else's well-being into consideration. But the internal experience is completely different. Compassion, in its healthiest form, comes from a place of choice and capacity. It is offered because the person has the emotional bandwidth to give it, and giving it does not deplete their sense of self. Hypervigilance, by contrast, comes from a place of perceived necessity. It is not optional. It feels less like generosity and more like an alarm system that cannot be turned off, constantly scanning for emotional shifts in others as if safety depends on it. This distinction matters enormously, because if someone mistakes their hypervigilance for compassion, they will continue operating from a depleted, anxious state while believing they are simply being a good person. They will not recognize the toll it's taking, because the behavior has been mislabeled internally as kindness rather than survival. Over time, this creates a quiet form of self-erasure. The person becomes so practiced at sensing what others need that they lose touch with what they themselves need. Their internal compass, which should be oriented toward their own well-being as much as anyone else's, becomes almost entirely externally focused. Recognizing this paradox is the first step toward changing it, because patterns rooted in survival cannot be undone through willpower alone. They require a different kind of awareness, one that asks, is this response coming from genuine care, freely given, or is it coming from an old, automatic fear of what might happen if I don't manage everyone else's emotions first? That single question, asked honestly and repeatedly, begins to separate authentic compassion from conditioned hypervigilance. And once that separation becomes clear, the person finally has the option to choose differently, to offer care when they actually have it to give, and to step back when they don't, without guilt distorting the decision. When a person who has consistently shown up in a particular way suddenly stops, the resulting disruption reveals something that was always true but never visible. The relationship or social system around them had quietly organized itself around that person's output. This isn't speculation or exaggeration. It's a basic principle of how dynamics stabilize over time. Every relationship, family structure, friendship circle, or workplace develops an equilibrium. And that equilibrium is maintained by patterns of behavior that everyone involved comes to expect, even if no one ever discusses it openly. If one person has been the one who initiates contact, smooths over conflict, remembers important details, or absorbs emotional labor without being asked, that behavior becomes load-bearing. The system leans on it the way a building leans on a support beam, without anyone consciously registering that it's there until it's removed. This is why withdrawal produces such a disproportionate reaction relative to what actually changed. From the outside, all that happened is that one person stopped doing something they used to do voluntarily. No one was harmed. No promise was broken. And yet the people around them often respond as though something significant has shifted. Because something significant has shifted, just not in the way they initially assume. They don't recognize that the previous behavior was a form of ongoing labor. They only recognize its absence as a kind of loss, often experienced as confusion, irritation, or even accusations of having changed for the worse. The truth is closer to the opposite. The person didn't become someone different. The system around them is simply being asked, for the first time, to function without a subsidy it had been receiving for free. This dynamic is rarely framed honestly in real time, because the people benefiting from someone else's consistent emotional output are often unaware that they were benefiting from anything at all. To them, things were simply normal. Reliable check-ins, easy forgiveness, constant availability, and proactive conflict resolution didn't feel like gifts being given. They felt like the baseline. This is precisely why the withdrawal feels so disruptive when it happens. A baseline that quietly shifts feels like the ground moving, even though nothing was ever guaranteed in the first place. The discomfort people feel in this moment is data about the previous arrangement, not evidence that something has gone wrong with the person who stopped. It's also worth recognizing that this withdrawal effect isn't limited to romantic relationships or close friendships. It shows up in families, in workplaces, in friend groups, anywhere an unspoken division of emotional labor exists. The colleague who always remembers everyone's birthday, the sibling who always mediates holiday tension, the friend who always initiates plans. Each one is providing a structural function that the group has come to depend on without acknowledgement. When that function stops, even temporarily, the absence becomes far more visible than the presence ever was. People who never said, "Thank you for always reaching out first," will suddenly notice with surprising intensity that no one is reaching out at all. Understanding this pattern offers a kind of clarity that's hard to get any other way. It shows, with unusual precision, what was actually happening beneath the surface of a relationship the whole time. The reaction to withdrawal isn't really about the person who stopped. It's a mirror reflecting exactly how much unacknowledged labor was being absorbed, and by whom, for how long, without anyone ever calling it what it was. Stepping back from chronic emotional labor is frequently misread, by the person doing it and by everyone around them, as a slide into coldness or indifference. This misreading matters because it can prevent someone from making a healthy change out of fear that they're becoming a worse version of themselves. The reality is that there are two entirely different processes that can produce a similar-looking outward behavior, and confusing them leads to a lot of unnecessary guilt, or in the opposite direction, a lot of unexamined numbness mistaken for growth. The first process is apathy, which is a genuine loss of feeling. It tends to develop after prolonged emotional exhaustion has gone unaddressed for so long that the nervous system essentially shuts down the capacity to care as a protective measure. This isn't a choice, it's closer to a collapse. A person experiencing this state often feels flat, disconnected, even from situations that would have once affected them deeply. They aren't selectively withdrawing their energy, they've lost access to the energy altogether. This is not a sign of progress or empowerment, even though it might look similar from the outside to someone setting a boundary. It's a warning sign that depletion has gone past a sustainable point, and it usually requires rest, support, or deeper repair rather than being treated as a strategy worth maintaining. The second process is fundamentally different, even though it can resemble the first in early stages. This is intentional detachment, where a person retains the capacity to care but becomes far more deliberate about where that capacity gets directed. This isn't the absence of feeling, it's the presence of discernment. The person can still notice someone else's distress, still understand the emotional stakes of a situation, still hold compassion as a value, but they no longer treat every demand on their attention as an emergency requiring immediate full engagement. They've essentially built a filter between stimulus and response, where previously there was no filter at all, just automatic, immediate emotional output regardless of whether the situation actually warranted it. The distinction matters because the first state, apathy, tends to shrink a person's world and isolate them further, since it strips away the felt sense of connection that makes relationships meaningful in the first place. The second state, intentional detachment, actually expands a person's capacity over time, because energy that used to be spent reflexively, on situations that didn't deserve it, or people who didn't reciprocate it, becomes available for relationships and causes that genuinely matter to them. It's not a smaller life, it's a more concentrated one. Recognizing which state someone is actually in requires honest self-observation rather than assumptions based on outward behavior alone. The relevant question isn't whether someone has stopped doing as much for others as they used to. The relevant question is whether the capacity for care still exists underneath, waiting to be offered selectively and intentionally, or whether that capacity has gone quiet because it was never given the chance to recover. One of these states is a sign of someone reclaiming agency over their own emotional resources. The other is a sign that those resources were drained past the point of sustainability, and deserves attention and care of its own, rather than being mistaken for strength. People in relationships often only adjust their behavior when there is an actual cost attached to crossing a boundary, rather than simply being told that a boundary exists. This is one of the more uncomfortable truths about human dynamics, because it suggests that words alone, no matter how clearly or repeatedly spoken, frequently fail to produce change on their own. Someone can say, "I need you to check in on me sometimes too," or "I can't keep being the one who always reaches out dozens of times," and the dynamic can remain exactly the same, not because the other person is necessarily malicious, but because spoken requests without consequence are easy to acknowledge and just as easy to forget. The information gets received, but it doesn't get encoded as something that requires action, because nothing in the person's lived experience has changed as a result of hearing it. What changes behavior far more reliably is a shift in actual experience. When the emotional output someone has been providing simply stops, even temporarily, the people around them are no longer working with an abstract idea of a boundary. They're working with its real, felt absence. This is a fundamentally different kind of information, because it bypasses the need for interpretation or agreement. No one has to decide whether the boundary is reasonable or fair. They simply experience what life looks like without the thing they had been receiving, and that experience speaks with a clarity that conversation rarely achieves. This is why withdrawal of emotional investment functions as a kind of universal signal. It doesn't depend on the other person's willingness to listen, their emotional intelligence, or their interpretation of tone. It operates on the level of direct cause and effect. This is not about manipulation or punishment, and it's important to be precise about that distinction. The goal isn't to withhold care strategically in order to control someone else's behavior or extract a particular reaction. The goal is far simpler: stopping the automatic, unconditional output that was never sustainable in the first place, and allowing the natural consequences of that change to unfold without interference. If a relationship was healthy and reciprocal underneath the surface, the other person will likely notice the shift, ask what changed, and make space for a more balanced dynamic going forward. If the relationship was built primarily on one person's constant emotional labor, the other person may pull away entirely, revealing that the connection was never really about mutual care to begin with. Either outcome provides valuable, undeniable information that no amount of conversation could have produced as clearly. This is also why withdrawal feels so much more powerful than asking. Asking puts the responsibility for change entirely in someone else's hands, requiring them to understand, agree, and follow through. Withdrawal simply changes the conditions and lets reality do the explaining. People tend to respond to conditions far more consistently than they respond to requests, because conditions don't require trust in someone else's follow-through. They are immediate and self-evident. This is precisely why someone who has spent years over-explaining, justifying, and requesting basic reciprocity often finds that a single sustained act of stepping back accomplishes more in a matter of weeks than years of conversation ever did. It isn't louder. It isn't more dramatic. It's simply more real, and reality, more often than language, is what finally shifts behavior that words alone could never quite reach.